Tell us about your first academic position post-graduation.
Yeah. Well, post UMass, you
Okay.
mean? Yeah. Because, of course, I had an academic position at Brooklyn College.
Correct, yes.
But my first position was at UMass. And this is how it happened. I took a job in the Massachusetts Department of Education after I graduated. So I defended my dissertation in June, and I started the job in September of 1979. That was a regional office of the Massachusetts Department of Education, and it was I worked within that office for the Bureau of Equal Educational Opportunity. What was really funny is that the office wasn't that big. Maybe there were 20 of us who were professionals working there, and 3 of the 4 of us who worked in the Bureau of Equal Educational Opportunity were from Brooklyn. Does that say something? Right? Really interesting. So I worked there for a year, and that job taught me a number of things. The first thing that it taught me is that I was really not cut out to be a bureaucrat. Mm-hmm. I missed teaching terribly. I missed higher education. And, I knew that that wasn't my element. But it was also wonderful for me because I learned a lot about the law, and I learned how to drive all over Massachusetts, which, I hadn't necessarily done before. And I met some very good people. I worked with very good people because that was a regional office, but I worked across offices, and so the main office was in Boston, and so we put on conferences, and I did a lot of parent involvement work in that job, and it was very good for me. But I was really, really ready to get into academia. So Luis Fuentes, who had been one of my mentors, had written a grant with A.D. Becker, a woman from Brown University, and it was to have I think it was called the Bilingual Education Service Center, to serve all of the Northeast. Mm-hmm. They got a very big grant, and one of the positions was to work in the School of Education at UMass. Mm. This doesn't happen anymore, but at the time it was as an assistant professor, which really doesn't happen. So I was really lucky. They hired me after I had been working for a year in Springfield for the Massachusetts Department of Education. And so I started work in November of 1980, which is a weird time to start, but in the meantime I had been teaching a course for them. And so it was a non-tenure track assistant professor position, and mostly my job was to do parent involvement, to work with parents and families all over Massachusetts, but mostly from Worcester west. So that's a huge area. But at the same time, I was teaching a couple of courses at the university because I wanted to sort of make sure that people knew that I was an assistant professor there also, because I was hoping that in the future I'd have the opportunity to sort of slide into a tenure track position. Mm-hmm. So I was there for about 3 years when a tenure track position became available. And I applied for it, and I got it. So that's how I started. I was doing double duty, besides having 2 young kids. I was also doing all this parent involvement work, and I was doing, my teaching. So I didn't have very much time to do any scholarly work. And I have to say that being at Brooklyn College, because of the times in which I was there, it was a very political time. So the people in my department at the time, it's very different now, but at the time we were not thinking about publications and presentations or conferences or anything like that. It was takeovers and demonstrations and, all of this. So I wasn't really prepared, and then I was doing parent involvement, so that was not doing a lot of, scholarly work. And so I had to really sort of learn that. And it wasn't until 1980, I don't remember, 86 or something, that I went up for tenure. Maybe it was 88 actually, that I went up for tenure because I took 5 more years after the 3 years that I had already served, because those 3 years I hadn't really done very much. So when I went up for tenure, I really was, now I wouldn't have gotten tenure.
Is that right?
For what I had, in my portfolio. But things were different then also.
Sure.
It wasn't only me. Yes, I had some journal articles and I had a few book chapters, but there wasn't the pressure that there is nowadays, and there certainly wasn't the pressure in terms of grants. So I was lucky that I got tenure. People knew me as a very good teacher and mentor, and I was just getting into the academic and scholarly work.
When did you really start going all in terms of that scholarly work?
I have to say that it probably started after I wrote Affirming Diversity, which was, I had a couple of co-edited books before them, but it was really my first book that was a major undertaking. And that book really changed my life because it made my career. And because I had written that, then I started to get lots of invitations to write for journals and to do other books and to do presentations. I had done presentations before, of course. I had been a keynote speaker and so on, but this gave me a national visibility that I hadn't had before, and that's when I went all in. For example, I got a call shortly after Affirming Diversity came out, which was 1992, and it was from a young woman named Gladys Capella, who was a student, a doctoral student at Harvard, and she was on the editorial review board. And as you know, the editorial review board is made up of doctoral students. And so she called me to tell me that she loved Affirming Diversity and that she was editing one of their reprint books. But their reprint books, they reprint articles from the Harvard Ed Review. She said, so we're doing this a little backwards, but we want you to write an article for the Harvard Ed Review that I can include in the book that I'm co-editing. So, and that article has been reprinted, I think, in 6 or 7 of the reprint books, which is pretty amazing. And it was selected as one of the 12 best articles in the Harvard Ed Review for the century. It was amazing. I just couldn't believe it. So that really started me and, took me from practice to, more theoretical and scholarly work. And I loved it. It was really wonderful. And it just shows, that a book can change your life. And I always say to people, look, I know that now in academia what they want is rough-read journals more than anything. But unfortunately, those journal articles don't get read very much, and what gets read and what makes a difference usually in terms of, I have to think in terms of teachers and schools, are books. That's what gets more visibility. So, it's because of that book, and then, then I started hearing from Jim Banks, who I know is also inside the academy, who he actually got in touch with me way before I wrote Affirming Diversity, because he was writing teaching strategies for ethnic studies, that he started in the 70s maybe, and it was in the 80s, I think it was 1984, that he got in touch with me, and he asked me to review the chapter on Puerto Ricans, because he had called the Center for Puerto Rican Studies in New York, and they had recommended my name, which also kind of surprised me. I thought it was wonderful. So he sent me like a 10-page chapter that he was going to revise for the next edition, and I worked on it the whole month of January when we had a break. And I sent him, for these 10 pages, I sent him 17 pages of notes. And luckily, he thought that was great. Said he had never gotten such comprehensive feedback. And so that's how I started working with Jim Banks. And then after my first book, he was starting his multicultural education series with Teachers College Press, and he asked me to write a book for him. And that was the book that I wrote on my second sabbatical. Not completely, but that I did most of it. So yeah, by then I was all in, and I really started seeing the synergy among the practice, the teaching, the service, and the scholarly work. And so I really tried to connect all of them throughout my career at UMass.
Okay. Speaking of Dr. James Banks,
Yes,
your longtime friend and colleague, he recalls a memorable conversation with you over coffee at an annual American Educational Research Association AERA conference, during which he encouraged you to write this multi-education textbook that you're describing. Yeah. He describes your initial hesitation and insisted that another book in addition to his own was not needed in the field at the time. Needless to say, he affirms the important contribution of your book, written a few years later, as one of the seminal and most widely used textbooks in the field of multicultural education.
Yeah.
Now in its 6th edition with Patty Bodie. In terms of your impact in the field of multicultural education, what school reforms are still needed to ensure equal and equitable access to education for diverse students?
I think what I would say is that the kinds of reforms that are needed would be helpful for all students. But the students who I worry most about are the kids who have not been well served by public education in our country. And so I would look at kids, at immigrant kids, at kids whose families have been here for generations and generations, but who are still not doing well in school as a group, so including African Americans, Native Americans, kids for whom English is a second language or a third or fourth language,
sure.
And kids who live in poverty, and kids with special needs. So those are all the kids that I think we need to focus our attention on, but most of the things that we do for those kids would be helpful for all kids. I had a friend, Mel King, who's a wonderful politician and visionary, really. He was a state representative in Massachusetts, and very keen on education and worked with young kids and still does. He's now 86 years old, I believe. And I remember one time he was talking about the fact that when you make changes to benefit some, if you're doing it in the right way, these things often benefit a lot more people. So he gave the example of curb cuts. So curb cuts were because of accessibility for people in wheelchairs. But don't they help mothers with carriages and people on bicycles and people who need a little extra help crossing the street and getting down from the curb? So I think that's how we need to think about education also. So the kinds of reforms I think we need is, of course, getting away from this obsession with high stakes testing, which doesn't help most kids. It doesn't help most kids. It doesn't help them to think more critically or more clearly. It doesn't help them to be more creative. And so I think that, changing that approach. I'm not saying that I'm against all testing. I think some testing, of course, is necessary, and assessment is necessary. But we have lost sight of the goal. We really have. And so even kids who do well in school, they get sick, physically sick, for example, with the thought of taking the test. My granddaughter, who's now 11, said that she and her friends call the MCAS, which is the MCAS, the high stakes, Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment Systems. They call it murdering kids at school. That's nice. That really says something. That one before. Yeah, that says something, doesn't it? And she's a very good student in a very good school. And so if we made these changes for the kids who are the neediest, it would help all kids, So that's one. But for example, language assistance for immigrant kids and kids who need to learn English, why not have that for everybody? So that everybody could become bilingual, it wouldn't hurt. Changing the curriculum so that it is more honest and more inclusive. You don't have to make it up. We really do have examples in our history and in our arts and in so many other things of the importance of people of all backgrounds. So that's what our history is, but it's not what kids are necessarily learning, but it would benefit all kids. It would benefit all kids to learn about the contributions of women in our history, in our arts, in our politics, and so on. And we haven't. This is one of the lowest approaches, according to Jim Banks, is the contributions approach, and yet we're not even there, where kids learn about how everybody has contributed. And also just, a more critical understanding of U.S. history, that it shouldn't just be about, triumph and wars and, just one way of looking at things. So I think that these things would benefit everybody.
Okay. In terms of your work in multicultural learning communities, which is related, your former student and now co-author, mentioned prior, Dr. Patty Bodie, describes you as courageously determined and notes that your tenacious commitment is evident in your determination to ensure equitable public education for all students, especially those whose educational journeys have been impeded by institutional racism, who are dedicated to maintain their home languages while learning English, and who have been marginalized by social structures. What inspires you in terms of your scholarly endeavors in this area?
I guess, I'd have to say that that the children inspire me, and kids who have to face racist attitudes every day, who have to go into a school where they're not valued in the same way as other kids. They inspire me, and teachers inspire me. The last several books that I've written are about teachers. And look, I know that there are some people who should not be teachers, and I always say that. But there are magnificent teachers who we have just been giving such a short shrift to, that makes such a difference in the lives of kids. And yet they are they're under so much pressure nowadays. And, I always say, look, there are great teachers and, really master teachers. And then there are teachers who could be, but too many of them leave because the conditions are so difficult. They don't feel respected. They don't feel that they're being treated as professionals, as intellectuals. They feel that they are being talked down to. We have such wonderful teachers that should be honored
and celebrated.
Yeah, absolutely.